Good afternoon, everybody. Michael Bellicosa, the head of adult programming at Wilton Library. And on behalf of the Wilton Historical Society and all of us here at the library, welcome to today's program. It's the second lecture in the annual series that we put together in collaboration with the Historical Society. And we've been doing this now for 16 years, covering a very wide range of topics related to history in general and very often history specifically in Connecticut. We really enjoy working with the Historical Society on this, and I want to thank all the members of our planning committee for all the work that we did to settle on the theme, come up with some topics, and then, of course, to secure the speakers. I'd also like to thank our donors who make programs like this possible, and also a special thank you to the sponsor of today's lecture, which are the donors in memory of Bob Kelso, who was a library trustee and also had a very strong interest in American history. Our next two lectures are on Sunday, March 12 and March 26, and those will be at the Historical Society, also at 4 o'clock. So we hope to see you there. All the information about the lectures and links to register are on our event calendar and also on the website of the Historical Society. So please sign up and we'll see you then. One final note, please turn off your phones and devices as we get ready to start the lecture. And with that, please join me in welcoming our moderator today, Max Gabrielson.
Thank you, Michael. As Michael said, today's lecture is sponsored by, in memory of Bob Kelso, a longtime Wiltonian who served as a library trustee and treasurer, a Historical Society trustee, Board of Finance member, and other local positions. I didn't have the pleasure of knowing Bob personally, but I did teach two of his granddaughters, Ella and Sydney, who I will tell you are very accomplished Latin scholars. I would also like to join Michael in thanking the members of our lecture series planning committee, including Michael, Rob Stack, Mary Gail Christina, Virginia Gunther, Stephen Hudspeth, Nick Foster, and Caroline Mandler. I also wish to thank Matt Warschauer, whom some of you may recall, has lectured here frequently in our series over the years and was especially helpful this year in recommending to us two of our speakers, including today's speaker, Dr. Camesha Scruggs. Raise your hand if you were here a week ago for the lecture by Janice Adams. I was under the weather at the time, did not have a chance to be present, but I did watch it on YouTube. And I was struck by her eloquence and insight, a really marvelous lecture, especially when she said, "A knowledge of history is the key to healing ourselves and others." That really registered with me. She also observed that history is, quote, like a traveler's diary, surveying all we have seen and done, and where we have been and what has become of us as we press along life's route. Those who have come before us have faced the same crossroads we now have, many of the same treacherous twists in the road. But we, being together here today, are proof of their success. That also registered with me, and I appreciated her tribute to you as her audience. And so we are delighted today to have with us Dr. Camesha Scruggs, a professor of history at Central Connecticut State University. She earned her doctoral degree in history from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She is a native Texan and received both her bachelor's and master's degree in history from Texas Southern University. Her research fields are 20th century U.S., African American public history, and gender and empire. She serves on the executive boards of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History and the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites. Her current project examines the lived experiences of Texas African American women domestic servants in the early 20th century and how interventions from social, civic, government, and higher education institutions impact that occupation. Her lecture is entitled, Kids in Kitchens, the Role of Children and Domestic Workers in the Civil Rights Movement. Please join me in offering up a warm Wilton welcome to Dr. Camesha Scruggs. Thank you.
Make sure I have all of my notes and all of my things. Good. Can everyone hear me? Good. I am going to try to stay on time. A professor at my undergraduate institution, Dr. Thomas F. Freeman, who interestingly taught Martin Luther King philosophy at Morehouse, said something that I try to live by often. He says, what we do well, and what we don't do well, we don't do at all. So in the spirit of my institutions and my ancestors, that is going to be my goal for today. So the title of today's talk is called Kids in Kitchens, Change Agents in the Civil Rights Movement. In that, I like to think about the individuals that sometimes are not often discussed when we think about the civil rights movement itself. We often think about adults that are participants, right? We think about Martin Luther King, we think about Rosa Parks, but if we have to really look at it, it was really children that were pushing this movement forward. They were the impetus for this movement. And also, domestic workers are also sometimes not often mentioned in these civil rights discussions. There's scholarship by individuals including Jean Theo Harris that talk about the role specifically of domestic workers in Montgomery. So we'll get started. So the first question that I often ask is, who participated in the civil rights movement? And often we have the images of Rosa Parks that is sitting on a bus, or we have Dr. Martin Luther King and his March on Washington, his I Have a Dream speech. Yes, those are part of the civil rights movement. We can kind of consider them somewhat of bookends of the movement. But I want to talk about what happens in between that and a little bit before Rosa gets on the bus and before Martin Luther King gives his speech. So there are a few things. I'm going to go thematically. I will mention dates, but for the most part, I want to think about this in a thematic context. So when we talk about children, we often don't see them. However, there were these series of events that kind of shaped the civil rights movement and kind of its direction. One that I tend to think about, the first one that I think about, is Topeka and Little Rock. The first image on the top left is, of course, capturing the Supreme Court decision from Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. Just to give just a simple version of that, it is a gentleman by the name of Brown was trying to enroll his daughters in addition to other African-American families, but due to the separate but equal mandate, that was not, of course, not an option. So, of course, they, in partnership with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, they advocate on a local level, but they also eventually take this to the Supreme Court, resulting in the Brown versus Board decision education that we all know that happens in around May of 1954. So we really see it is about children, right? We see that children really are at the center of these civil rights struggles that we think about in the modern civil rights movement. The image at the bottom is of the desegregation incident or desegregation attempt at Little Rock in Arkansas. So once again, we see that education is one of these impetus, but we also see once again that children are at the center, although these children are high schoolers, but as a college professor, if you're under 21, you're still a kid to me. So that's one of those instances where we talk about the role of children being involved in the civil rights movement. Now, of course, in the civil rights movement, unfortunately, there were casualties of this movement. And these casualties served also as a catalyst for change. One of the ones I want to talk about is this particular instance of which a young man, by the name of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old young boy, leaves his town in Chicago to go visit his family in Mississippi. Unfortunately, due to allegations of perceived assault, possibly, he loses his life. This happens August. The actual date that we associate it with is August 28th of 1955. This is important because we'll see a few years down the road kind of the culmination of this. His body is badly disfigured. He is beyond recognition. However, his mother takes the courageous act of holding an open casket funeral in Chicago. This becomes part of the media because she wants the world to know the injustice that is happening. And her son happened to be a casualty of that. We also can think about that even in modern context as well. But we'll stick with my time frame of the civil rights movement for this moment. But once again, children at the center of this movement. Another casualty is the bombing that happened at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, September 15, 1963. 4 young girls, Denise McNair, Cynthia Wesley, Addie Mae Collins, and Carol Robertson, were simply 4 young ladies getting ready. They were in the basement, they were putting on their gloves, they were putting on lip gloss, they were simply preparing for a morning of worship. And unfortunately, there was an act of violence in which there was an explosive device, and of course the building is not completely demolished, but there are portions that are demolished. And these 4 young girls are unfortunately the casualty. But what's interesting about these 4 young ladies is, once again, they too serve as a catalyst for the movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., when he actually is the speaker for the eulogy, when he eulogizes these young ladies, one of the things that I tend to think about is that he says that the death of these young ladies should serve as a way for us to work passionately and unrelentingly for the realization of the American dream. That's interesting to me. The fact that, once again, children are at the center of this particular movement. Now, of course, just a little backdating a little bit before September of 1963. In May of 1963, there's an event that happens in Birmingham, Alabama, called the Children's Crusade, in which 5,000 young people, 5,000 children are marching in the streets of Birmingham in hopes of enacting change. For me, I see them simply building on the tradition of children being catalysts for change. Because in 1917, there was an event called the Silent March in New York City, Fifth Avenue to be exact, in which there are thousands of children that march, that are at the front of this particular march. And their goal was to send a message to President Woodrow Wilson to advocate for legislation in the hopes that they will not have to grow up and be victims of racialized violence. So I simply see the Children's Crusade being a part of that tradition. But with this particular Children's Crusade that happens, what we see is, for the first time in large media outlets, we see the instance of Bull Connor putting water hoses and dogs on children. That, once again, prompts the nation, prompts the world to think about, what did these children do? What did they do to enact adults to try to dissuade them from simply advocating for their lives and for their future. Once again, children at the center of the civil rights movement. So that's a little bit of discussion when we think about children in the civil rights movement. So I'll move on to the second half of my talk, where I actually talk about kitchens, or specifically domestic workers. I am a proud descendant of domestic workers in Texas. My research project examined domestic workers, particularly in the early 20th century. For me, it was somewhat of an academic love letter to my grandmother and the community elder women that would tell me their stories of working in homes, but also how they too were advocating and their children would integrate school districts. So for me, this is somewhat of a personal project. So when we think about domestic workers, sometimes we don't really see them. They are often hidden. They are hidden in their workspaces. They're hidden in their kitchens. They're hidden in homes. But this particular domestic worker, by the name of Georgia Gilmore, was a domestic worker in Montgomery, Alabama. She happened to lose her job, but she used her labor to advance the movement of the Montgomery bus boycott. Her and other domestic workers used their labor. They made meals. They sold these meals, and they named themselves the group from nowhere. So therefore they couldn't, of course, be implicated. But the funds from those sales, from that work, from their labor, literally put gas in the vehicles of cars that were participating in this 381-day disruption in Montgomery. So if it were not for the labor of these domestic workers, the Montgomery bus boycott would not be as successful. So for those women, I'm grateful. They are sometimes the unsung heroes of the movement. And this, of course, is just a simple image of some of these workers. The image on the top left, actually on the top right, are of domestic workers, right? They are avoiding the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. They are walking to work. But we can also see them prompting people to action because they are bringing in other individuals. They're bringing in their employers because, of course, their employers, if they can't ride the bus, but they still need their employers. So in a way, they're kind of unofficially initiating others and calling them to action by having their employers sometimes bring them to work. So they too are a part of the civil rights movement. So we see domestic workers kind of bringing other people into the movement. Which brings me to this image on the bottom right, which is from the 1963 March on Washington, or the formal title, the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, letting us once again know that labor, the work, was important. The work of women like domestic workers was important. Workers' rights, labor rights were indeed important. When we examine other civil rights movements, we see that domestic workers often are the impetus behind this. Sometimes they use their actual labor to literally fuel the bus boycott, but we also see them as bringing information sometimes to these community meetings. So once again, these kitchen workers are central to the movement. And I'll bring you to my last slide, kind of a combination of kids and kitchens of sorts. So I think about the topic of lunch counter sit-ins. The image at the top is from the February 1st, 1960 lunch counter sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina, in which college children, they're still children to me, sit at lunch counters protesting and demanding service. I can't get my students sometimes to turn in homework, but these young people, well-dressed, bringing their, their anatomy and physiology homework, their algebra homework, and they're doing the work. They're sitting here and they are trying to advocate for change. In the midst of that, they're being trained because once again, they're thinking about their current situation and they're thinking about their future. In the bottom image, there is a couple of young ladies no, that I would like to focus on. The two young ladies actually in the image. The young lady, the African American young lady, her name is Ann Moody, where she talks about her life. She actually has a work coming of age in Mississippi. But the young lady with the bun, Joan Trump-Hauer Mulholland, actually was a young white lady. Ended up going to a historically black college in Mississippi and being, once again, an integral part of the civil rights movement. And this is when we get our freedom riders as well. Once again, young people using their voices. But I think about a lunch counter. It's a kitchen space. It's, the space of this domestic work that I'm sure that their parents or their community members were a part of. But yet they sat in these spaces to advocate for change for themselves and for the future. So I said I would wrap all this up, right? So when we think about the March on Washington in 1963, there are children that attend that. I think about Dr. Adams and her comments last week when she was talking about how she got on a bus and ended up going to the March on Washington. So to think about children doing the unimaginable, the bravest things, and elder women, domestic workers, kitchen workers, women that are working in these spaces are convening to come and make change happen in the civil rights movement. Thank you.
This is our Q&A. If anyone has any questions for Dr. Scruggs.
Or comments.
Stephen, can I get you a microphone?
It's a fascinating presentation. Thank you for it. I wanted to ask you, I'm thinking about the children in Little Rock and the picture you had there.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any study of the psychological impact of them continuing on into adulthood from having been at the forefront of the whole movement as young children?
To my knowledge, no, but Melba Patillo-Beals actually speaks in her work about her experience being part of the Little Rock movement. Perhaps she may have talked about like the impacts, but I can only imagine what that's like when I have chatted with some of my own community elders who have integrated schools in North Texas. Sometimes they will speak about it. They will talk about some of the challenges. And I think for some of them, it advised them that they're not doing it just for them, right? It's for other individuals. But as far as a psychological impact, I can't think of any at the moment.
Hi, thanks for that wonderful lecture. I'm really curious, there's this common perception, you see it in the media, you see it pretty much throughout American culture, where white people will see black children and perceive them as older than they actually are. And I'm really curious about the history of that perception and how it might or might not intersect with the civil rights movement. Is it that old? Is it a more recent phenomenon?
Well, when we think about the misperceptions of the African American body, there's been a history of that. Even thinking back as far back as slavery, when we think about the value that we put on individuals, right? They're valued based on their body, based on the work that they can do. And as far as them being adults, I think about when I look at the images of busloads of children, buses of children being sent to jail, right? Once again, you know that these are children and you're putting them on a school bus and you're sending them to jail. Like, you have to realize, what are the optics on that? What does that look like, right? But you are seeing them as disruptors, right? You're treating them as if they're adults because they're disrupting. But when you think about why they're disrupting, they're simply operating in a child sense of, this is not fair to me. So I'm simply reacting to something that's not fair to me. So I would say that the phenomenon of inappropriately aging children has a history and has a tradition, but in regards to the civil rights movement, some instances, yes, right? When we look at, sadly, incarceration, even execution, some of these were children, were 12 and 13 and 14 that were losing their lives. So unfortunately, this is not a new phenomenon.
Thank you for the overview.
Thank you.
I'm interested to know about what was the interaction between the children and their parents and the families, because the children, many will act when they see injustice, but in the family unit, how does that support them, hinder them? What was going on within those families that would enable, a children's march or support those children who then became freedom riders or whatever throughout the movement, because they became an important part and focal point?
I think we would have to examine the role of community activists like Daisy Bates when we come to Little Rock, for example. It wasn't, yes, these children were involved, but they were aware that they were doing something important. Often they were supported by their family and their community, right? These children that are part of these lawsuits, these children that are being asked to integrate these schools, right? Like that, I can only imagine what that would be like, to get dressed and to go to school and to know that I may be subject to injustices simply because of who I am. I think about Ruby Bridges, right? She's 6 years old. She is going to kindergarten. Everyone thinks kindergarten is great. You get to meet new friends, you get to take naps and color and all of that, but yet she has to take on this adult task of being in a classroom by herself because of the actions of parents, right? Because the parents of the children that were to be in the classroom with her elected to remove their children from the classroom. So it was definitely a support by family and community for these children to do this brave and courageous and adult-like thing.
Nick?
Thank you. I had a question about, sort of to follow up on that. Do we find, similar today when you see college activists or young people activists, there's a pushback against them as their perception of young and saying, you don't actually know what you're doing, you're idealist.
Right.
Do we find that in the movement as well, even from within the movement and supporters who may have been more moderate saying, you guys are young, leave this to adults, you don't know what, you haven't have enough life experience yet. Do we find that in this case?
We do, because we often see that it's the adults that's it's their job, it's their mission to do this on behalf of children, right? That they feel that perhaps they are too young. There may be a risk involved with children, but yet we still see these young adults. When we think about the Freedom Riders, for example, they were of sound mind when they were doing things like writing their own wills in the event that if anything happened to them while participating in these Freedom Rider movements. So yes, there was pushback. There were adults that felt that this was an adult matter, but yet children understood on a base level that this is happening to them regardless of who they are, that it's happening to their personal selves as well as their friends, as well as their family members. So they felt that they wanted to have action on that, and they were empowered by that. I think we see Annie.
Hello. I was just wondering, the children are sent to school.
Mhm.
Have there been any studies as to what the parents of these children did in a physical way, other than making the decision to send their child into a situation? What did the parents do to make it more comfortable or more palatable for their kids?
Oh, wow. That is a good question because I think about the parents that are involved. It's not as if these parents were financially secure enough to where they could not be employed. The parents were making risks themselves, right? Because these are parents. The parents could lose their jobs because their children are being involved in these movements, right? So it wasn't just let me worry about my child, but I have to worry about livelihood as well. And that's an enormously large risk for something that I think is far greater, that has a far greater value than any tangible financial value for them, I think.
If I may, I'd like to follow up on Jenny's question. Oh, someone up there. Follow up on Jenny's question and focus on the adults in the process. The domestic workers that you've described in the Montgomery March, I'm thinking in particular, and the boycott, I mean, they were very, very well organized. Did their adult leadership among the domestic workers themselves later continue in that role in other capacities as the civil rights movement moved forward? Were they leaders, in other words, beyond the actual boycott?
We see them in a supportive role. However, when we think about domestic workers in that, just think about the fact that domestic workers were not protected by things like Social Security. They didn't start to have these rights until the 1960s and 1970s. So they're using this kind of somewhat as a catalyst for their own labor rights, right? So we see them as leaders in labor rights when we start to think about the home technicians unions that start popping up in the late 1960s. So we do see them advance their cause. And there's a hand up front.
Yes, I have a question about like Ruby Bridges and what effect that singular event had on her, and if that's consistent with other prime targets or
Other instances.
advocates. And a second question to that is I'm just thinking today, youth is involved. I mean, young kids that age, not college. I mean, that's a little, I mean, I think that's different. But young kids, like in climate change marches, they've been active, but there's a whole peer group. So they're not singled out. So I guess I'm kind of asking those two questions there.
So the first question is these isolated incidents, right? When we think about Ruby Bridges, it wasn't just Ruby Bridges. There was also another group called the New Orleans Six. So often in these cases, they weren't alone, right? They were happening in other cities. They were connected through organizations like the NAACP, which is a national organization. So they're aware that these are happening in other cities as well. So they may not, in the geographic sense, be together, but collectively, as far as an action and a movement, they definitely have a community. And you are right, when we think about like these climate change activists, these young people, often, high schoolers, they think about that. They have their own community. When we think about how do they communicate? The joys of social media, right? Like they join, that's how they collectively create their community nowadays. I just imagine what that was like in the 50s and 60s when they didn't have social media, but yet they knew that they may have a cousin in another city that was participating in some type of march or some type of movement. So of course they would talk on the telephone. So there were these ways that they were collectively communicating and advocating all at the same time in these different spaces.
And with respect to Ruby Bridges, do you know, I mean, has she spoken about what that experience was like for her?
I know that she still does lectures. I believe she has written somewhat of a biography. I know that there have been talks that I know that are available where she talks about her experiences. So she is still lecturing today about her experiences. And Mrs. Bridges, I believe, is close to 70. So, that's a half a century of like beyond this experience that she's still talking about it. And I can only imagine how she feels seeing some of these similar things still happening half a century after her event.
Can you say anything about the role of the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee in the actions of Martin Luther King and that phase of the civil rights movement?
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, of course, headed by Ella Baker, right, in which we see individuals that are aware of children, right? In most cases, we think of individuals like high school teachers. We think of people like Daisy Bates, right? And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they are doing these things, except for they're doing it on a student level. We see the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee being involved in even some of these lunch counter sit-ins. Although the gentleman in this photo are from North Carolina A&T, there were also women that were involved in this. They actually attended the historically Black College for Women, Bennett College. They were involved in this as well. And we do see them doing this work, but however, on a student level. Martin Luther King definitely supports their efforts. He supports their methodologies. However, I think he focused more on the overall and more of an adult focus. But we see the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee kind of being the youth version of moving the movement forward.
Do we have any further questions for Dr. Scruggs? Thank you so much
No, thank you.
for your wonderful lecture. We have a reception in the back of the room. Well, you'll have an opportunity to ask more questions, I hope.
Answer more questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here.